Sometimes suffering arrives without warning. A phone call, a mistake, a loss, a disappointment. And sometimes we understand why we suffer. The reason is clear. The cause is obvious, but other times, the suffering remains. Even after the problem is gone, even after the situation has changed, even after life has moved on. Why? Hello, everyone. Before we begin, I'd like you to think about something. Have you ever noticed that two people can experience the same event, yet suffer very differently? Imagine two travelers caught in the rain. Neither wanted the storm. Neither expected it. Both are soaked. Both are uncomfortable. Yet one traveler spends the entire journey complaining, fighting reality, wishing the rain would stop. The other traveler opens an umbrella, accepts the weather, and keeps walking. The rain falls on both, but the suffering is not the same. Why? Let's think about that. Now imagine holding a glass of water. The glass isn't heavy. Not at first. You can hold it for a minute, perhaps 5 minutes, maybe even 10. But what happens after an hour? Your arm begins to ache. What happens after a day? The pain becomes unbearable. The weight of the glass never changed, but the length of time you carried it did. Many emotional burdens work the same way. Sometimes the event is not what hurts us most. Sometimes it's how long we continue carrying it. Now imagine a dog chasing a stick. You throw the stick. The dog runs after it, again and again. Now imagine throwing the stick into a river. The dog watches it float away. For a moment it looks confused. Then it turns around and continues living its life. Simple, natural. But people often do something different. We throw our thoughts into the river of time, yet we keep running after them. A conversation from 5 years ago, a mistake from 10 years ago, a rejection, an embarrassment, a failure. The event drifts away, but we continue chasing it, again and again and again. Now imagine two arrows. The first arrow strikes your leg. It hurts. Of course it hurts. Pain is natural. No one can avoid all pain. But then imagine taking a second arrow and shooting yourself with it. That second arrow is different. The first arrow was the event. The second arrow is the story. This shouldn't have happened. Why me? My life is ruined. I'll never recover. The first arrow creates pain. The second arrow creates suffering. And often, the second arrow stays much longer. Now think about a broken cup. Imagine dropping your favorite cup onto the floor. It shatters. The cup is gone. Nothing can change that. One person cleans up the pieces, feels disappointed, then moves on. The other person spends months staring at the broken pieces, thinking about them, talking about them, wishing the cup had never fallen. The cup broke for both people, but suffering remained for only one. Life often works this way. Pain is part of life, but suffering often grows from resistance. Now imagine standing on a beach. A wave comes toward you. If you stand rigidly against it, the force feels stronger. You lose balance. You struggle. But if you move with the wave, something changes. The wave still arrives, but the experience becomes different. Many people spend years fighting waves that have already arrived. Reality says, this happened. The mind says, this should not have happened. And the battle begins. Now imagine two trees during a storm. The first tree is completely rigid. It refuses to bend. The second tree sways with the wind. It moves, it adapts, it survives. The storm visits both trees, but only one understands flexibility. Perhaps suffering works the same way. Sometimes our pain becomes heavier because we refuse to bend. We refuse to accept. We refuse to adapt. Not because we are weak, because we are human. Now let's look at another example. Imagine a child building a sandcastle. The child spends hours creating it. Every tower is perfect. Every wall is carefully shaped. Then the tide comes in. The waves erase everything. The child cries. The castle is gone. Years later, the same child becomes an adult. But many adults continue building sandcastles. Not with sand, with expectations, plans, dreams, ideas about how life should unfold. And when reality changes those plans, the suffering begins. Not because having dreams is wrong, because we become attached to a particular outcome. Now imagine holding a handful of sand. The tighter you squeeze, the faster the sand escapes. Open your hand, and the sand can rest there peacefully. Life often feels similar. The harder we try to control everything, the more frustrated we become. Now here's something interesting. Many people believe happiness comes from getting everything they want. But think about your own life. How many things did you once desperately want? A job, a relationship, a promotion, a possession. You finally received it, and for a while you felt happy. Then something happened. The happiness faded. A new desire appeared, a new goal, a new problem, a new worry. The cycle continued, again and again and again. It's almost as if suffering is not caused by lacking things alone. Sometimes it comes from constantly needing reality to be different from what it is. Think about that for a moment. Now imagine a river. The river doesn't argue with rocks. It doesn't complain about bends. It doesn't demand a straighter path. It simply flows around obstacles, over obstacles, through obstacles. And because it keeps moving, it eventually reaches the ocean. There is something peaceful about that image, and perhaps something important. Because many of us spend enormous energy fighting things we cannot change. The past, other people, time, aging, loss, reality itself, and the fight becomes exhausting. Now think about your own life. What are you resisting? What reality are you arguing with? What wave are you still trying to push back into the ocean? Because sometimes suffering is not only about what happened. Sometimes it's about our refusal to let reality be reality. And that's where things become interesting. Because if suffering is created one way, perhaps it can also be released another way. But how? Let's continue. If suffering is so painful, why do we create so much of it? Why do we keep returning to thoughts that make us unhappy? Why do we replay memories that hurt us? Why do we hold on to worries that may never happen? Perhaps because the mind is trying to protect us. Imagine walking through a forest. One day you touch a thorn. It hurts. The next day, your mind reminds you about the thorn. Be careful. Don't forget. Watch where you're going. At first, this seems useful, and it is. The mind remembers pain so we can avoid danger. But sometimes the mind becomes overprotective. It continues sounding the alarm long after the danger is gone. Now imagine a smoke detector. Its job is to warn you about fire. That's important. But imagine if it continued ringing for weeks after the fire was extinguished. Eventually, the warning becomes its own problem. Many worries work the same way. The event ends, the danger passes, but the mind keeps ringing the alarm again and again and again. Now imagine two people giving a speech. Both feel nervous. Both make small mistakes. Both finish the presentation. The first person goes home and thinks, it wasn't perfect, but it's over. The second person replays every mistake, every awkward moment, every word, for days, perhaps even years. The speech lasted 10 minutes. The suffering lasted much longer. This happens all the time. An event may occupy a small part of our lives, but our thoughts can keep it alive indefinitely. Now imagine carrying a suitcase through an airport. The suitcase is heavy, but manageable. Then imagine stopping every few steps to open it. Check it. Worry about it. Examine it. Soon the journey becomes exhausting, not because of the suitcase alone, because of the attention you're giving it. Many emotional burdens grow this way. Attention feeds them. The more we revisit them, the larger they seem. Now think about a small scratch on a car. The first day, you notice it immediately. You can't stop looking at it. But after enough time, something changes. The scratch remains, yet it no longer dominates your attention. The scratch did not disappear. Your relationship with it changed. Perhaps suffering works in a similar way. Sometimes peace does not come from removing every problem. Sometimes it comes from changing where we place our attention. Now imagine two gardeners. Both discover weeds in their garden. The first gardener spends every day staring at the weeds, talking about the weeds, thinking about the weeds. The second gardener removes what they can, then spends most of their time watering the flowers. Months later, both gardens look very different. What we focus on tends to grow. This is true in gardens, and often true in life. Now let's think about comparison for a moment. Imagine a man walking through a beautiful valley. The weather is perfect. The scenery is breathtaking. The journey is peaceful. Then he notices another traveler. That traveler has a larger backpack, better equipment, a faster pace. Suddenly, the valley no longer seems beautiful. Nothing changed. The mountains are still there. The sky is still blue. The birds are still singing. Only his attention changed. And with it, his experience changed. Many forms of suffering begin this way, not with reality, but with the story we create about reality. Now imagine sitting beside a river. Leaves float past on the water. One leaf appears, then disappears. Another arrives, then leaves. Thoughts can be similar. Some thoughts are useful, some are not. Yet many people treat every thought as if it deserves their full attention. Imagine grabbing every leaf that floats by, trying to keep it, trying to analyze it, trying to understand it. Soon you'd be exhausted. The river would continue flowing, and you'd still be holding leaves. Many people do this with thoughts. Every fear, every doubt, every worry, every imagined future. They pick it up, carry it, examine it, and wonder why they feel overwhelmed. Now imagine the sky. Clouds appear, clouds disappear. Some are dark, some are light, some stay longer than others. But the sky remains. Thoughts are like clouds. Emotions are like clouds. They come and they go. Yet suffering often begins when we forget this. We see a dark cloud and assume it will stay forever. We feel sadness and believe it defines us. We experience fear and assume it will never leave. But emotions move. Thoughts move. Life moves. Nothing remains exactly the same. Now imagine an old man sitting on a bench. A young traveler asks him, "What is the secret to a peaceful life?" The old man smiles, then points to a nearby pond. The water is muddy. The traveler looks confused. An hour later, the old man points to the pond again. The mud has settled. The water is clear. The old man says, "Sometimes clarity comes from stillness, not from force, not from struggle, not from constant thinking, just stillness." How often do we forget that? How often do we believe every problem must be solved immediately? Every question answered, every uncertainty removed. Perhaps that belief creates more suffering than the uncertainty itself. Now think about your own life. How much suffering comes from reality? And how much comes from the stories surrounding reality? How much comes from what happened? And how much comes from replaying what happened? These are important questions because many people spend years trying to change circumstances they cannot control, while ignoring the one thing they can influence: their relationship with those circumstances. Think about that for a moment, because there may be a different way to live, a lighter way, a calmer way. A way that does not require reality to be perfect. But before we get there, there's something else we need to understand. Imagine that you spend your entire life trying to stop the rain. Every time clouds appear, you become frustrated. Every time a storm arrives, you become angry. Every time the weather changes, you resist it. How peaceful would your life be? Probably not very peaceful. Now imagine someone else. They don't enjoy every storm. They don't celebrate every rainy day. But they understand something important. The weather does not ask for permission. Some things arrive whether we welcome them or not. And because they understand this, they suffer less. Not because their life is easier, because they spend less energy fighting reality. Now think about the ocean. The ocean contains calm days and violent storms, gentle waves and powerful waves. Yet the ocean remains the ocean. It does not panic every time the surface changes. There is something beautiful about that, because many people live as if every emotion is permanent. A bad day arrives, and they believe life is falling apart. A difficult week arrives, and they believe happiness is gone forever. But emotions are often like waves. They rise, they fall, they return to the sea. Now imagine a traveler walking through a long tunnel. The tunnel is dark, cold, uncomfortable. The traveler feels discouraged. Then imagine stopping halfway through, building a house inside the tunnel, deciding to stay there forever. It sounds absurd, yet many people do something similar emotionally. A difficult season arrives, and they begin to believe that season is their entire future. A loss happens, and they assume joy will never return. A failure happens, and they assume success is no longer possible. But a season is not forever. A tunnel is not a destination, and a difficult chapter is not the whole book. Now imagine two people planting trees. The first person digs up the seed every day. They want proof that it is growing. They want certainty. They want immediate results. The second person waters the seed, protects it, and allows time to do its work. Months later, one person has a tree. The other has only frustration. Many people treat life like the first gardener. They demand certainty. They demand guarantees. They demand immediate answers. But life rarely works that way. Sometimes growth is invisible. Sometimes healing is invisible. Sometimes progress is invisible, yet it is happening beneath the surface, quietly, patiently. Now let's talk about control. Imagine holding a kite. A gentle grip allows the kite to fly. But what happens if you pull too hard? The string snaps. The kite falls. Many people spend years trying to control everything. Other people, the future, outcomes, circumstances, time itself. And the harder they try, the more exhausted they become. Because some things can be guided, but not controlled. Think about that. For a moment, how much suffering comes from trying to control things that were never ours to control? Now imagine a man standing beside a river. In one hand, he holds a stick. The river carries leaves downstream. The man spends all day trying to stop them. One leaf, then another, then another. Hour after hour, day after day, the leaves continue flowing. The man becomes exhausted, not because the river is strong, because his task is impossible. Sometimes suffering feels exactly like that. We try to stop time. We try to stop change. We try to stop loss. We try to stop life from moving. And life keeps moving anyway. Now imagine an elderly woman sitting on a porch. The sun is setting. A young person asks her, "What is the secret to a happy life?" The woman smiles. Then she says, "I stopped arguing with reality." That's all. Not because reality is always pleasant. Not because life is always fair. Because peace begins when the argument ends. There is wisdom in that. Perhaps more wisdom than we realize. Now let's go a little deeper. Many people spend their lives chasing happiness, as if happiness is a destination, a place to arrive, a prize to win, a mountain to reach. But what if happiness is not something we find? What if it is something that appears when unnecessary suffering disappears? Imagine carrying a heavy backpack for 20 years. One day you finally set it down. You don't suddenly become rich. You don't suddenly become famous. Nothing dramatic happens, but you feel lighter. You breathe easier. You walk more freely. Sometimes peace arrives that way. Not because something was added, because something was released. Now think about a river again. The river reaches the ocean not because it fights every obstacle, but because it continues flowing. Around rocks, around fallen branches, around unexpected turns. Perhaps life asks the same thing of us. Not perfection, not certainty, not endless control, simply movement. One step, then another, then another. Now think about your own life. What are you still resisting? What are you still trying to control? What reality are you still arguing with? And what might happen if you stopped? Not forever, just for today, just for this moment. What if you allowed things to be exactly as they are? What if you stopped carrying the second arrow? What if you stopped chasing yesterday? What if you stopped demanding that life follow your plans? Perhaps you would discover something surprising. The burden becomes lighter. The mind becomes quieter. The heart becomes calmer. Not because every problem disappears, because your relationship with those problems changes. And sometimes that changes everything. Now here's the final thought. A tree suffers less when it bends with the wind. A river suffers less when it follows its course. The seasons suffer less because they do not resist change. Nature understands something that people often forget. Life is always moving. Life is always changing. Life is always unfolding. And suffering often grows when we demand that it do otherwise. Before we finish, I'd like to leave you with one simple idea. Pain is part of life, but suffering is often the story we continue telling ourselves about that pain. Think about that, just for a moment. It may change the way you see your struggles. It may change the way you see yourself. And perhaps, it may help you find a little more peace. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Keep learning, keep growing, and remember, you don't have to fight every wave. Sometimes you only need to let it pass. And see you in the next story.